Hey everyone! I have officially lost my voice, so instead of an audio recording of the lecture, I'm going to use my trusty computer to read my notes to you for the second half of this chapter. I realize that this is not an ideal arrangement, so please let me know if you still have questions about anything after reviewing the slides. As you are aware, the first half of the lecture covered the essentials of sight. Today, we will cover the perceptual processes underlying the visual system and the other sensory systems you have: auditory system, gustatory system, olfactory system, and touch sensory system. For this slide, go ahead and click on the link and watch this video demonstration. You can pause this lecture presentation as you watch the video. Once you are done, come back to this lecture presentation and go to the next slide. The previous video demonstration did a pretty nice job, I think, of demonstrating the importance of perceptual processes. Just because your sensory system receives some type of external stimulation, does not mean you actually perceived it. For the picture above, do you see a seal balancing a ball in front of a trainer? Or two ballroom dancers? This is an example of a reversible figures drawing that is compatible with two different interpretations that can shift back and forth. In this case, your interpretations result in two different realities because your expectations have been manipulated. Information given to you about the drawing has created a perceptual set, readiness to perceive a stimulus in a particular way. Form perception also depends on the selection of sensory input, that is, what people focus their attention on. The moonwalking bear video illustrates that concept really well. One vigorously debated theory of form perception is that the brain has cells that respond to specific aspects or features of stimuli, such as lines and angles. In this way, perception of a form is arrived at by assembling elements from the bottom up. The figure above describes how you have different neurons that function as feature detectors early on in the visual pathway, but others function as more high-level analyzers. Feature analysis assumes that form perception involves bottom-up processing, which is a progression from individual elements to the whole. But there is evidence to the contrary that perceptions of form often involve top-down processing, which is a progression from the whole to the elements. For example, think about how you will always find some spelling mistake somewhere every time you review your paper. If we depended exclusively on bottom-up processing, we would have to analyze every feature of letters and words to recognize them. That would make identifying spelling and grammatical mistakes all the more easier. Sometimes a whole, as we perceive it, may have qualities that do not exist in any of the parts. This insight, that the whole is greater than some of its parts, became the basic assumption of Gestalt psychology. The word Gestalt is a German word meaning form or shape. A simple example of this principle is the phi phenomenon. It is the illusion of movement created by presenting individual visual stimuli in rapid succession, fast enough so that it is perceived as a whole. The Gestalt theorists developed a set of principles that describe how the visual system organizes stimuli into perceptions. They include figure ground, proximity, closure, similarity, simplicity, continuity. We'll look at some examples that illustrate these principles. Figure ground. Dividing visual displays into figure and ground is fundamental in which people organize visual perception. In this example, whether you see two faces or a vase depends on which part of this drawing you see as the figure and which as the background. Although this reversible drawing allows you to switch back and forth between two ways of organizing your perception, you can't perceive the drawing both ways at once. Proximity refers to our tendency to perceive that things that are near one another actually belong together. These dots might well be organized in vertical columns rather than horizontal rows, but because dots are closer together horizontally, they tend to be perceived in rows. Closure refers to our tendency to group elements together to create a sense of closure. Even though figures are incomplete, you can fill in the blanks and see a circle and an animal. Similarity refers to our tendency to group stimuli that are similar. Because of similarity of color, you see dots organized into the number 2 instead of in a random array. Simplicity refers to our tendency to group elements that combine to form the most simple, parsimonious figure. You could view this as a complicated 11-sided figure, but given preference for simplicity, you are more likely to see it as an overlapping rectangle and triangle. Continuity refers to our tendency to follow in whatever direction they've been led. You tend to group these dots in a way that produces a smooth path rather than an abrupt shift in direction. In visual perception, the images projected on the retina are distorted, two-dimensional versions of their actual, three-dimensional counterparts. If the sensory input is so distorted, how do people get an accurate view of the world? The explanation is that people are constantly making and testing hypotheses about what's out there in the real world. These hypotheses are called perceptual hypotheses. Let's look at some ambiguous drawings that illustrate the process of making perceptual hypotheses. So what do you see? A young woman or an old woman? You can perceive this drawing in both ways, and then you can switch back and forth between them, but you don't see both at once. Incidentally, studies show that people who are led to expect the young woman or the old woman generally see one they expect. The Necker cube is an example that shows how our expectations can shape our perception of three-dimensional figures. The shaded surface of this cube can be perceived as the front or the back of the cube. If you stare at it a while, it will switch perspectives for you. The context in which a stimulus is seen can affect your perceptual hypotheses. The middle character in the word on the left is assumed to be an H, whereas in the word on the right, the same character is assumed to be an A. In addition to showing the potential influence of context, this example shows the power of expectations in top-down processing. Now, more often than not, forms and figures are objects in space. Spatial considerations add a third dimension to visual perception. Depth perception involves interpretation of visual cues that indicate how near or far away something is. There are two types of clues used to make judgments of distance: monocular cues, that is, clues from a single eye, and binocular cues, that is, clues from both eyes together. Binocular cues include retinal disparity, which refers to the fact that objects within 25 feet project images to slightly different locations on the left and right retinas. Thus each eye sees a slightly different view of the object. The closer an object gets, the higher the retinal disparity, thus providing your brain information about distance. Monocular cues are clues about distance based on the image in either eye alone. Pictorial depth cues are cues about distance that can be given in a flat picture. There are 6 prominent pictorial depth cues. First is linear perspective, where parallel lines that run away from the viewer seem to get closer together. Text gradient refers to the principle that as distance increases, a texture gradually becomes denser and less distinct. As seen here in this painting, the texture of ships or objects further away are more dense and less distinct. Interposition refers to the principle that shapes of nearby objects overlap or mask those of more distant ones. As seen here, the ship in the middle clearly overlaps the ship that is further back. Bullet. Relative size refers to the principle that if separate objects are expected to be of the same size, the larger one are seen as closer. Height and plane refers to the principle that near objects are low in the visual field, more distant ones are higher up. Light and shadow refers to the principle that patterns of light and dark suggest shadows that can create an impression of three-dimensional forms. Recent research has also shown that estimates of distance can be skewed by people's motivational states. Studies suggest that people see desirable objects as being closer to them than less desirable objects. Another related tendency we have is also perceptual constancy, which is the tendency to experience a stable perception in the face of continually changing sensory input. So as someone approaches you from a distance, even though his or her image on your retinas gradually changes size, you do not perceive that person as growing right before your eyes. For the blue dress, as the day becomes brighter during the day and becomes darker towards of the day, our eyes are constantly making perceptual hypotheses in regards to what factors may be influencing the real color of an object. People who see this as blue and black, for example, attribute to colors to coming from the dress itself, like seeing a dress in the mall. People who see this as white and gold attribute the colors to coming from the environment, like how this white and gold dress may look like on a bright sunny day. Auditory system. Like vision, the auditory, hearing system provides input about the world out there. The stimulus for the auditory system is sound waves, which are actually vibrations of molecules. Sound waves must travel throughout some physical medium, such as air. Like light waves, sound waves are characterized by their amplitude, loudness, wavelength, frequency, and purity, timbre. Frequency is measured in cycles per second. Higher frequencies are perceived as having higher pitch. Humans can hear sounds ranging in the frequency from a low of 20 Hz up to a high of about 20,000 Hz. Low-frequency sounds under 10 Hz are audible to homing pigeons. Bats and porpoises can hear frequencies well above 20,000 Hz in general. The greater amplitude of waves, i.e., larger decibels, the louder the sound perceived. However, the relationship between decibels, measure of physical property of sound, and loudness, a psychological quality, is complex. Amplitude. As you can see here, the threshold for human hearing, graphed in green, is a function of both sound pressure, decibel level, and frequency. Human hearing is keenest for sounds at frequencies around 2000 Hz. At other frequencies, higher decibel levels are needed to produce sounds people can detect. On the other hand, the human threshold for pain, graphed in red, is almost purely a function of decibel level. Timbre refers to the purity or complexity of sound. Think of a note with precisely the same loudness and pitch played on a piano and then on a violin. Like your eyes, your ears channel energy to the neural tissue that receives it. The human ear can be divided into three sections: the external ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. The external ear consists of the pinna, which collects sound. Sound is transmitted through the vibration of air molecules. The middle ear consists of a mechanical chain made up of three tiny bones in the ear: the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, known collectively as the ossicles. Sound is transmitted through the vibration of movable bone and converts large movements with little force to small movements with large force. The inner ear consists of the cochlea, a fluid-filled, coiled tunnel that contains the hair cells, the auditory receptors. Sound is transmitted through the vibration of liquid. The hair cells are lined up on the basilar membrane, which runs the length of the spiral cochlea, holding the auditory receptors, called hair cells. Initially, there were two of what appeared to be competing theories of how our auditory system is able to translate sound: place theory and frequency theory. What is place theory? Hermann von Helmholtz, 1863, proposed that perception of pitch corresponds to the vibration of different portions, or places, along the basilar membrane. Thus, different places have different pitches, like keys on a piano. What is frequency theory? Other researchers, Rutherford, 1886, proposed an alternate model called frequency theory, which holds that perception of pitch corresponds to the rate, or frequency, at which the entire basilar membrane vibrates, causing the auditory nerve to fire at different rates for different frequencies. Thus, according to this theory, the brain detects the frequency of a tone by the rate at which the auditory nerve fires. It turns out that both are valid. In part, the two were reconciled by Georg von Békésy, 1947, with his traveling wave theory. According to his theory, hair cells along the basilar membrane vibrate according to different frequencies, as suggested by frequency theory. However, the waves also peak at a particular place, depending on the frequency of the sound wave, as suggested by place theory. Current thinking suggests that pitch perception depends on both place and frequency coding of vibrations. Low-frequency pure tones appear to be translated into pitch through frequency coding. High-frequency pure tones appear to be translated into pitch through place coding. Complex tones depend on complex combinations of frequency and place coding. This animation shows how the basilar membrane vibrates in response to sound frequencies. You can see how the entire basilar membrane vibrates, but there is a particular place that vibrates more for higher frequency pure tones. Gustatory system. Psychologists have devoted most of their attention to the visual and auditory systems. Although less is known about the senses of taste, smell, and touch, they also play a critical role in people's experience of the world. Let's take a look at the gustatory system, the sensory system for taste. The physical stimulus for taste are the chemical substances that are dissolvable in water. Receptors for taste are clusters of cells found in the taste buds, which line the trenches around tiny bumps on the tongue. These receptors have a short life, which is approximately 10 days. In fact, new receptor cells are born at the edge of the taste bud and migrate inward to die at the center. These rich inner cells absorb chemicals, trigger neural impulses, and send the information throughout the thalamus and onto the cortex. The four primary tastes are sweet, sour, bitter, and salty, with uneven distribution on the tongue. Clearly, taste results from a complex blend of these four, as well as learned and social processes. Research reveals that people vary considerably in their sensitivity to certain tastes. This may be a matter of genetic inheritance. In the United States, roughly 25% of people are non-tasters. These people tend to have about 1/4 as many taste buds per square centimeter as people on the other end of the spectrum. 25% of people are called supertasters. Supertasters have more taste buds and have more specialized taste receptors compared to non-tasters. Supertasters are much more sensitive to certain sweet and bitter substances. Thus, supertasters are less likely to be fond of sweets, tend to consume fewer high-fat foods, and react more negatively to alcohol and smoking. Downside of being a non-taster is that they also respond more negatively to many vegetables. Overall, however, supertasters tend to have better health habits than non-tasters. Olfactory system. Smell, olfaction, operates much like the sense of taste. The physical stimuli are chemical substances carried in the air that are dissolved in fluid, the mucus in the nose. Olfactory receptors are called olfactory cilia and are located in the upper portion of the nasal passages. They resemble taste cells in that they have a short life and are constantly being replaced. Olfactory receptors have axons that synapse with cells in the olfactory bulb and then are routed directly to the olfactory cortex. Smell is the only sensory system that is not routed through the thalamus before it projects into the cortex. Humans can distinguish among about 10,000 odors, but for some reason have a hard time attaching names to odors quite frequently. The senses of taste and smell are very strongly related to each other. If you lose your sense of smell, it affects your ability to adequately taste food. Touch system. The physical stimuli for touch are mechanical, thermal, and chemical energy that impinges on the skin. The skin has at least 6 types of sensory receptors, which are routed throughout the spinal column to the brainstem. For example, your skin has receptors for pressure, heat, cold, and so forth. Interestingly, these distinctions are not as clear as researchers had originally thought. For people with chronic pain, it is possible that pressure receptors are sending signals to pain receptors. That is why they are experiencing pain all the time. You have larger receptive fields in certain areas of your body, such as your back, and small receptive fields in other areas of your body, such as your fingertips. So if you were to poke 2 different areas on the back of your body, and those 2 areas happen to fall under the same receptive field, you won't be able to tell if it was 1-2 pokes. These receptive fields are the functional equivalents of receptive field in vision, the area in which your rods and cones fire in response to light stimuli. How do we register pain? Well, we know that pain signals are sent inward from receptors to the brain along the 2 ascending pathways. The fast pathway, shown in red, registers localized pain and relays to the cortex in a fraction of a second. This is the system that hits you with sharp pain when you first cut your finger. The second system uses slow pathway, shown in black, which routes through the limbic system, that lags a second or 2 behind the fast system. This system, which also conveys temperature, conveys the less localized, longer-lasting aching or burning pain that comes after the initial injury. Pain perception is inherently subjective. Some people with severe injuries report feeling very little pain, while others with minor injuries report high levels of pain. The gate control mechanism hypothesized by Melzack and Wall, 1965, holds that incoming pain sensations must through a gate in the spinal cord that can be closed, thus blocking ascending pain signals. This gate is most likely a descending neural pathway that appears to originate from the midbrain. Initiated by the endorphins, the circuits in this pathway inhibit the activity of neurons that would normally transmit pain signals to the brain. Placebo effects, for example, depend on the action of endorphins. This explains why factors such as attention and expectation can shut off pain signals. And that wraps up the lecture on sensation and perception. I hope you found this presentation and slides to be informative, and I hope you let me know if you have any questions whatsoever about this chapter. Thank you for listening and see you next week.